Hey, thanks for being here. Imagine a place that once buzzed day and night with the sound of assembly lines, Motown music drifting from car radios, and neighborhood diners packed with families. A city that helped build modern America. Now picture those same streets, quiet, homes abandoned, windows boarded up, echoes where conversations used to fill the air. That city is Detroit, once the beating heart of American industry, now known by many as one of the world's largest ghost cities. But how did it end up like this? Was it simply factories shutting down? Or was there something deeper? Decisions made, families moving away, an entire economic foundation slipping out from under the city. In this video, we're going to walk through that story together. We'll look at the rise, the tensions, the turning points, mostly history and facts, but with the human moments that bring those facts to life. And throughout it all, we'll keep returning to one powerful truth: the collapse of the industrial engine that once fueled this city, and how that single change reshaped every neighborhood and every life. So grab a coffee and get comfortable, because we're heading back to the streets that once roared, and we're going to understand how silence slowly took over. Alright, let's begin with how Detroit became the engine of America. To understand how Detroit eventually became one of the world's most famous ghost cities, we need to go back to a time when it was the complete opposite. A place overflowing with energy, ambition and possibility. Because in the first half of the 20th century, Detroit wasn't just an American city. It was a symbol of what America could become. This was the birthplace of the modern automobile. Henry Ford didn't simply build cars. He rebuilt the way America worked. His assembly line changed everything. How products were made, how fast they moved, how affordable they could become. Suddenly, owning a car wasn't just a luxury for the wealthy. Ordinary families could buy one, drive farther, work more efficiently, and dream bigger. And every time production expanded, Detroit expanded with it. Factories stretched for miles. Smoke from steel and auto plants filled the skyline. Thousands of workers lined up every morning at Ford, GM, and Chrysler, the big three, ready to build another piece of the American future. People from all over the country, and from Europe, the Middle East, and the South, packed their bags and moved here for one reason: opportunity. By the 1950s and 60s, Detroit reached its golden peak. Nearly 2 million people called the city home. Suburbs were growing, downtown was alive, and the feeling of stability was everywhere. A good factory job meant a steady paycheck, a house, a car in the driveway, and college hopes for the kids. For many families, this was the closest the American dream had ever felt. And culturally, Detroit was unmatched. Motown records turned the city into a musical powerhouse. Songs born in small studios here echoed across the entire nation. The Temptations, the Supremes, Marvin Gaye. Their voices weren't just music. They were the heartbeat of a hopeful, confident America. Detroit felt unstoppable, a place where progress seemed guaranteed. But even in these bright years, cracks quietly began forming. Competition from foreign automakers was growing. Factories were aging and struggling to modernize fast enough. Racial tensions, housing issues, and political decisions brewed beneath the surface. On the outside, everything still looked strong. But inside, pressure was slowly building. People didn't see it then, but Detroit's golden age was standing on fragile foundations. And those foundations were about to be tested in ways no one expected. Every rise has a turning point, and for Detroit, the early signs of trouble began long before most people noticed. On the surface, the city still looked unstoppable. Factories running, neighborhoods full, the big three dominating the auto world. But beneath all that success, competition and pressure were quietly building. By the late 1950s and early 60s, foreign automakers, especially companies from Japan and Germany, were entering the global market with smaller, cheaper, and more fuel-efficient cars. At first, Detroit didn't take them seriously. American cars were big, powerful and familiar. Why would people switch? But slowly the shift began. Families wanted cars that cost less to run. Younger drivers wanted something new. And while foreign companies adapted quickly, Detroit's factories were still using old equipment, old strategies and old expectations. Changing an entire production system wasn't easy, and Detroit was realizing that too late. At the same time, automation was spreading. Machines could now do tasks that once required hundreds of workers. Companies pushed for efficiency, but that efficiency came with a cost. Fewer jobs, fewer hours, fewer opportunities. For a city built on labor, this was the first real shock. And then came the growing tensions inside the city itself. Housing discrimination, segregation, and unequal opportunities created deep divides between communities. Factories brought people together during the workday, but once the shift ended, neighborhoods told a very different story. Anger simmered just below the surface, and it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Detroit was still shining, but the cracks were widening. The foundation that once felt unbreakable was starting to tremble, and no one yet realized just how much the world was about to change. By the summer of 1967, all the quiet tension that had been building inside Detroit finally erupted. What had once been small cracks in the city's foundation suddenly tore open, revealing deep pain, anger, and years of inequality that could no longer be ignored. Everything began on July 23rd, during a police raid at an after-hours bar. It should have been a minor incident, something that ended within minutes. But Detroit wasn't the same city it had been just a decade earlier. Communities were frustrated, neighborhoods felt neglected, and trust between residents and authorities had collapsed. When the raid turned chaotic, the streets responded instantly. What followed became one of the largest and most intense urban uprisings in American history. For 5 long days, Detroit burned. Stores were looted, buildings were destroyed, and entire blocks disappeared under smoke. The National Guard and even federal troops were called in. But by the time order returned, the damage was irreversible, physically and emotionally. 43 people lost their lives, thousands were arrested, and countless families who had once believed in Detroit now felt something break inside them. The riots didn't create Detroit's problems, but they exposed them. They magnified the divisions in housing, jobs, education, and opportunity. They showed how fragile the city had become beneath its industrial success. And after 1967, something changed forever. People who had called Detroit home for generations began to look for the exit. Businesses quietly made plans to leave. Confidence in the city's future dropped, and the decline, once slow and almost invisible, started accelerating. Detroit survived the flames, but its spirit would never be the same again. From the 1940s through the late 60s, Motor City wasn't just a place, it was the beating heart of America. But as the 1970s approached, the cracks that had once been invisible in Detroit's foundation slowly began to show, and the moment that would change the city's destiny forever was now unfolding. Foreign automakers, especially those from Japan and Europe, were rising fast. Shaking the ground Detroit had stood firmly on for decades. Their cars were cheaper, more fuel efficient, and increasingly modern. For the first time, the legendary status of the American car was truly under threat. Assembly lines slowed, production was cut, and workers held their breath, waiting for the next round of layoffs. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, an earthquake for a city built on big engines and gasoline. Suddenly, those massive American cars no longer fit the average person's budget. Detroit's greatest strength had become its most painful weakness. For the people of the city, this wasn't just economic loss, it was an identity crisis. Building cars wasn't simply a job, it was their pride. As workers asked, "Where did we go wrong?" subway tensions inside the city began to rise. When factories shut down, entire neighborhoods emptied out. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter grew silent. Abandoned homes cast long shadows over Detroit's future. This turning point marked the beginning of Detroit's slow transformation into one of the world's most haunting ghost cities. And while outsiders might have seen it as just an economic downturn, beneath the surface lay broken dreams, fading confidence, and a heavy sense of uncertainty on the shoulders of every Detroit resident. By the mid-1970s, Detroit was no longer the Detroit people remembered. Once lively and full of energy, its neighborhoods didn't collapse overnight, but they grew a little quieter every single day. As factories shut their doors, thousands of workers lost their jobs and had no choice but to leave the city behind. And what they left wasn't just empty houses, it was a piece of time, frozen in place. Walking through Detroit now, what you felt was the fading heartbeat of a city losing hope. The neighbors who used to chat on their porches every Sunday had long since moved to other states. Homes that were once filled with laughter turned silent, then slowly deteriorated. Shattered windows, overgrown yards, garage doors hanging off the hinges. Every corner carried the marks of Detroit's slow but inevitable decline. As neighborhoods emptied, crime began to rise. Abandoned buildings quickly became forgotten pockets of the city, places where danger lurked once the sun went down. Streets that used to feel safe now held a quiet, uneasy darkness. People learned to stay indoors at night, locking their doors a little earlier than before. But even in this shadowed landscape, some Detroiters stayed, because for them, this city wasn't just a place on a map. It was childhood memories, family roots, and the work of generations. These were the people who refused to leave, saying, "This is our home," and their presence kept the city's spirit from disappearing entirely. During this era, Detroit streets became a living reminder of how a great city can slowly turn into a ghost. These empty neighborhoods weren't just abandoned structures, they were symbols of a lost time, a way of life that would never return. Detroit's destiny was shaped by the automobile giants, GM, Ford, and Chrysler. These companies didn't just build cars, they built the city's identity. They gave Detroit purpose, pride, and a booming heartbeat. But as the 1970s arrived, even these giants began to lose their footing. The industry that once fueled Detroit's rise was now slowly unraveling. To cut costs, companies started moving production to other cities and even other countries. Detroit was forced to watch as massive plants that once employed thousands transformed into silent, empty shells. For workers, this wasn't just losing a job. It meant losing stability, losing their plans for the future, losing the life they had built with their own hands. This shift rippled through the entire city. When factories shut down, local businesses suffered too. Corner stores, family restaurants, repair shops, small workshops. One by one, they fell like dominoes. As the industry collapsed, Detroit's economy struggled to breathe. Even the skyline began to change. Smokestacks that once sent plumes into the sky now stood cold and lifeless. Vast parking lots sat empty, echoing with nothing but the wind. The giant structures slowly crumbled, each crack on their walls a reminder of the city's fading past. Detroit's industrial collapse is one of the clearest answers to why the city is now known as one of the world's largest ghost cities. The very force that built Detroit was also the first piece to fall apart and the beginning of a long, painful decline. Detroit's economic downfall didn't begin and end with factory closures. It also pushed long-standing social tensions into the spotlight. By the time the 1970s arrived, the city was not only struggling financially, it was unraveling socially. People weren't just losing their jobs, they were losing their sense of security, their hope, and the social fabric that once held neighborhoods together. Racial division in Detroit had roots far deeper than most outsiders realized. Since the 1950s, the city had experienced an intense wave of white flight, as white families moved to the suburbs in massive numbers. This shift drained the city center of both population and economic strength. By the 1970s, the divide had grown into a painful, undeniable reality. Prosperous suburban white communities on one side, and struggling African American neighborhoods in the city center on the other. The gap between these two Detroits widened every single year. This divide reshaped the very structure of Detroit's neighborhoods. Finding a job in the city center became increasingly difficult. Schools lost funding and resources. Healthcare services diminished, and essential public services began to break down. For many residents, it felt as though the city had simply stopped caring. This sense of abandonment weighed heavily on the people who had no choice but to stay. Crime surged in several neighborhoods as legitimate opportunities dried up. With factories closed and businesses gone, young people found themselves with fewer and fewer pathways forward. Abandoned houses became hideouts for criminal activity, and the police struggled to maintain control. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter now fell silent at dusk, as families locked their doors earlier and earlier each evening. These changes inflicted deep emotional wounds. Hope slowly transformed into frustration. Solidarity gave way to mistrust. Neighbors, who once barbecued together on weekends or worked side by side on the assembly line, began to feel like they lived in completely different worlds. Friendships faded, community gatherings became rare, and the sense of belonging that once defined Detroit's identity started slipping away. The social cracks didn't just reshape daily life, they scarred the soul of the city. Detroit was no longer viewed solely as the proud capital of American industry. It became a symbol of lost unity and broken trust. The crisis wasn't just visible in boarded-up houses or abandoned factories. It was etched into the hearts and minds of the people who remained. And this is why Detroit's transformation into a ghost city wasn't merely the story of economic collapse. It was the story of a community slowly breaking apart. Because what truly keeps a city alive isn't just its industries. It's the hope, trust, and connection shared by the people who call it home. And during this era, Detroit was losing all of it. By the late 1970s, Detroit wasn't just suffering from economic and social collapse. The city was physically deteriorating as well. People walking through their daily routines found themselves surrounded by the ruins of what once made Detroit proud. The city felt like a massive, slow-fading monument to a past that could no longer be reclaimed. The enormous factories that once employed thousands now echoed with nothing but the wind. Broken windows, collapsing roofs, rusted machinery. These weren't just abandoned structures. They were silent reminders of a power Detroit had lost. Every crumbling wall and every dust-covered assembly line told the story of an era that had slipped away. The city's overall appearance had become almost surreal. Empty lots, collapsed homes, and streets overtaken by nature painted a haunting picture. Trees grew through the floors of old buildings. Weeds swallowed sidewalks, and streetlights that hadn't worked in years-left neighborhoods in an unsettling darkness. In many places, nighttime Detroit resembled an abandoned movie set more than a modern American city. Aside from a few passing cars, the streets were lifeless. The avenues that once buzzed with workers heading home, the sidewalks where families hurried with shopping bags, all of it had vanished. In their place stood towering, silent blocks of deserted buildings, looming over the city like shadows of a forgotten world. Detroit's ghostly face was unlike anything seen in another major American city. Its decline hadn't been sudden. It had been slow and visible. Residents watched the collapse happen day by day, street by street. Every empty home, every vacant lot whispered the same story. Detroit wasn't falling, it was dissolving. And perhaps the most haunting part was that the emptiness wasn't just physical. It lived inside the people who stayed. A city's visible decay is often the reflection of countless unfinished stories, broken futures and dreams that never found their way back. Looking at Detroit meant looking at a lost era, a broken identity, and a life that would never quite return. Even though Detroit's story in the late 1970s was filled with darkness, it was never truly hopeless. What made Detroit special wasn't the factories or skyscrapers. It was the people who stayed, the ones who refused to give up on their city. And even as neighborhoods emptied and buildings decayed, life continued to flicker stubbornly in certain corners of Detroit. Some small businesses kept their doors open, despite the shrinking customer base. Old shop owners, grocers, mechanics, tailors stayed because Detroit wasn't just a place to work. It was the center of their memories, their friendships, their routines. Every day they unlocked their doors. They added one more heartbeat to a city trying not to fall completely silent. Families held on to what they could. Even on blocks dotted with abandoned houses, a few homes still glowed warmly at night. Some mothers still took their children to the park. Some fathers still tended their yards. These small acts were reminders that a city doesn't truly die unless the people within it stop caring. Church choirs kept singing. Community centers continued hosting meetings and offering guidance. To young people searching for direction, neighbors leaned on one another in ways they never had before. These moments of unity were like sparks of warmth in Detroit's cold, empty streets. And then there were the dreamers, young people and artists, who saw possibility in the ruins. They painted murals on crumbling walls, turned empty lots into makeshift gathering spots, and filled silent streets with music. Creativity began to bloom in the very spaces that symbolized loss. It was as if the human spirit refused to let the darkness win entirely. Detroit wasn't rebuilding yet, but the earliest signs of future hope had begun to appear. As long as there was even a small breath of life left in the cracks of the broken city, the chance for rebirth remained. Detroit's ghostly shadow was long, yes, but within it, a single light still flickered. And that light leads us toward a final, powerful question. Can a city truly die? Or is every collapse simply the start of a new beginning? And now, as we reach the end of Detroit's long and turbulent story, we've seen how a city's destiny can shift little by little over the decades. In the 1970s, Detroit wasn't just building cars. It was shaping America's work ethic, community structure, and even its dreams. Every vehicle that rolled out of those massive factories carried the weight of millions of people's hard work, resilience, and hope for a better tomorrow. But time brought change. Economic storms swept through. Factories went silent one after another. Families who had built their lives in the heart of the city slowly moved to the suburbs, leaving neighborhoods emptier with each passing year. Yet even today, if you walk through Detroit's quiet streets, you can almost feel the heartbeat of the past, as though the laughter, the chatter, and the factory whistles still echo softly through the air. Those abandoned buildings don't simply show decline. They hold the imprint of a community that once thrived on unity, determination, and pride. Every shuttered factory reminds us of workers who arrived before sunrise, shared stories during their breaks, and believed that what they were building would shape America's future. And when we look at Detroit's history, we're reminded of an important truth. A city's greatness isn't measured by its skyline or population, but by the spirit of the people who built it. That's why Detroit's story isn't one of disappearance, it's the story of a powerful legacy waiting for its next chapter. The city may have fallen, but the spirit that once made it great is still very much alive. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Until the next video, where we uncover yet another forgotten chapter of America's past. See you soon.